Great. So this is the SIG-cluster-lifecycle meeting on the 2nd of May, 2017. Happy May, everyone. Sorry that I've been conspicuously absent for the last 2 weeks. Just had a very busy time with DockerCon and then recovering from DockerCon. But I'm back and happy to be back. So is there anything that anyone needs to fill me or the group in on before we start going through the agenda for today? Okay, cool. Apparently it's called Moby now. You're just trolling. Okay, so cool. We have meeting notes. First item on the agenda is Tim's draft HA proposal. I was just looking through that. Tim, are you on the call?
I am on the call. I'm just trying to make sure I have the right window here. Hopefully folks can see it. We sent around last week sort of a rough draft for high availability in kubeadm. There isn't really much that's, many folks have already commented on it and I've already adjusted and added their feedback in it. And if you haven't had a chance to read it and you have comments, feel free to make them. Most of the modifications to existing high availability are pretty non-controversial. There's some minor things in there that I think still requires further vetting and sort of POC work on. So why don't I just give a brief overview of some of the pieces here. I think what's important to note is the non-goals that are stated as the document. Is that I don't try to tackle certificate or token management because that's a whole separate space. Bootstrap discovery mechanisms, I think, is in the same category because those things can be integrated, but I think concerns. And I try to divide up the pieces here. So it doesn't try to be an all-encompassing proposal at this point, right? Because there's so many. It just tries to divide up the pieces into actionable items. Then there's taxonomy, and I talk about some of the existing problems. So one of the existing problems that we know is currently we lock on endpoints. This has known problems. It has a fan-out problem from the API server, right? Because endpoints is broadcasted to every single element in the cluster, even if it's an annotation, requires a sort of a broadcast to the whole cluster. So one of the modifications is to lock on config maps, and that's an action item to define how we're going to handle self-hosting in the world where we want to be able to load the component config versus passing a whole bunch of command line parameters. So that component config would be passed via config map. So that's listed down here in this section. Is there any questions about that bit? I'll stop for a second.
Sorry, I just wanted to, is that core? Like, do we have to do that, or could we continue to lock on config map? Like, it feels more orthogonal than like certificate management, for example.
I would definitely say it's not more orthogonal. You can continue to lock on endpoints, but you're going to have known issues that exist on it. So
yeah,
it is a separable concern that we can address, right? So the question was how we are going to do HA. So it is a fundamental component of how you do active passive locking. So it addresses the concern, but yes, it is a separable piece, and it's not a requirement for us to like do active passive with the scheduler and controller manager, right?
I mean, I'm happy that you're going to address it. I feel that we don't want to get bogged down in it.
Sure. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's a separable piece. So all of these pieces are separable. Right? The next item is how how we want to deal with etcd and sort of bootstrapping etcd. And I had talked with the CoreOS folks regarding this, and there was a pretty uncontentious view of using the etcd operator to spin up, start with a seed etcd and using the etcd operator to migrate to a full HA cluster. They have examples that exist inside of Bootkube, and I think formalizing it inside of the startup routine of the default configuration for kubeadm is something that we want to debate. I think we absolutely don't want to say that limit us. We still want to be able to provide the existing mechanisms, like passing in like a Bootstrap API, etcd Bootstrap API, or the potential to pass in, other potential backends that we don't yet currently support. But this would be the default for a simple self-hosted cluster.
So quick question here, Tim, and even though we work at the same company, I just read this morning because I'm a big slacker. So I have had a chance to discuss this stuff with you offline. One concern that I have here is that there's this sort of sequencing order of first you must call kubeadmin init, and then you must start the other masters, and then you must call kubeadmin migrate to make things work. And this makes it much more difficult to orchestrate this with something like Terraform or CloudFormation. Ideally, we'd be, and I note this in a comment later on, but you probably haven't seen it yet. Ideally, we'd be able to start up all the servers and then have them self-assemble without having any outside prompts. So I'd love to think about how do we make that migration step be sort of automatic and transparent.
Sasha had also made that similar comment, and I think that's totally possible to do if you seed it with something like a master setup, something that's seeded that says I'm going to have 3, right? If you seed that similar to what he's done in this PR here, which is 4473, I think that would automatically configure, right?
So if we had just the master size.
Yeah, it's basically saying my configuration is going to look like this, and then
etcd requires that, doesn't it? I mean, you need that just to get etcd going. It needs to.
No, you don't.
I thought. Okay.
No.
So with the etcd operator, what we do today in Bootkube is we just we start with 1 and then we expand to 3 once the cluster comes up.
Okay.
So in the effort for transparency, I've created the sort of the breakdown map, and this item exists down here at 254. So I think we can hash out the details for that specific one here if you want to. And
yeah, I'd like to go through those scenarios and look like what the order would look like, and yeah, because I think that is a critical use case for kubeadmin to be sort of drivable without some sort of overwrought outside management system.
I'm still why the multiple steps? Like in Bootkube, we just drop a bunch of static manifests across the entire cluster and then just wait.
That's what this comment is.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. So the initial thing was we can do that. I just had it very simple in the beginning, and then the comment was brought up, and then we can address it. So
okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Brandon, I think we've talked about a lot of the issues, and I think we're trying to discuss them and figure out all the edge cases there. I would say that it is very much not uncontroversial to do this, right? I feel like this is the one thing that is
totally
going to require a lot of explaining to users that yes, it is safe to manage etcd through Kubernetes, even though Kubernetes relies on etcd. And even I have issues with it. Even I don't understand all the edge cases, and I think there's a lot of persuasion that has to happen and a lot of testing.
Yes.
So this is a big commitment from you.
I think the other piece here too is that I don't want to not support passing in existing mechanisms that's what this current PR was all about, was just to use the existing etcd Bootstrap API to get rolling, right? So I think eventually there's this slow migration path towards from beta to GA that we'd have to vet, right? In the meantime, support both paths.
What do you mean by etcd Bootstrap API?
The
Discovery.
SCD discovery.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Sorry.
That's fine.
Is that we can vet or we can hammer out the details too. If you have questions, comments, complaints, concerns, we can always talk about it either in the doc or we can vet them with inside of the actual issue itself.
Yeah, it seems fine.
Yeah.
Quick question. Where is the data stored?
It would be stored local.
Locally, just on a path, since it's clustered. It's safe, right?
Yes.
Cool.
API server.
That's not the case in AWS, for example, or a cloud, right?
It can be or it can't. It depends, like how you configure it, right?
So we're going to have a dependency on, okay. We're going to have a dependency on persistent storage that we remount.
For what part?
Well, if you're going to assume that your disks survive.
I mean, just really all depends on how you think about failure inside the clouds, right? Like you can back it by EBS if you're like super paranoid about everything. You can back it by instance storage and rely on essentially etcd replication as your RAID. Or you can just like put, which is what GKE does, you just run a single etcd on replicated block storage and then you don't care about HA. Like essentially we provide users with all options because some people are less tolerant of failure than others.
And I think that
What's your concern, Justin? I mean, what's the scenario that you want to protect against?
The power off scenario.
Okay, so this is like everything shuts down, comes back up, and you're using instant storage.
Correct.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you should use backups or block storage. I mean, that's pretty not common failure scenario in clouds, right? Like that's a user mistake.
I wouldn't say it's, I mean, we could say that and then it will happen, right? Like every time we've said that will never happen, it's happened, right?
Sure, but that's a disaster recovery scenario, right? Like that's
Well,
not a
yeah, but then once you say disaster recovery, then you're talking about like, then you have to define your etcd backup strategy and your window of loss, right? This is like all the stuff that I had to deal with at my previous database company. And it's like, it's not, you get into the weeds here. But yeah, I think what I'll do is I'll link the issue where we have these failure scenarios enumerated into the.
No, but what's the solution here? I'm a little like, you're either using EBS or you're juggling.
Yeah,
and
so
if you lose all the disks, you're dead. I mean, is there another option?
one solution is to, I guess the most common solution is you manage your EBS volumes, you automatically reattach them.
Okay.
You then
So you're saying use
backups.
EBS, but use EBS in a way such that you're juggling those explicitly.
Correct. And then you have backups in addition, and restore for backup is a manual operation unless you can guarantee that restore from backup doesn't involve data loss, which I've never found a way to do. So it is always a manual operation.
I think documenting the different scenarios is useful for the ecosystem, and having it transparent from sort of the seed configuration all the way through would be highly useful to anyone who's trying to deploy. That way they can choose their own adventure, right?
So, I mean, just to be clear, is this to work around the fact that like auto-scaling groups in AWS are more like replica sets and not pet sets in terms of like if you lose them, they actually kill the disk?
They kill their local disks, correct. But you can also like attach another disk, and then you can do things. You can manually, or you can.
Yeah, you have to, from the outside, you have to fix it up.
Or from the inside.
Yeah. Okay. I think that what we can say is that we're relying on the underlying infrastructure to provide some persistence of disk. If all disks are lost at once, then you're in trouble. And then maybe like let's get the basics down here, and then provide a way for cloud-specific extensions to be able to do things like swap disks in as things reboot and that type of thing.
Yeah, we've started to like document and enumerate some of the recovery scenarios of this stuff on BootCube. We have a design doc that has come out of this comment that I put into the notes too. So happy to help. I just need to understand what all the actual concerns are.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a good discussion to have. Can I just clarify something? So what I thought I heard Tim say was that the proposal is that is that we use effectively local storage on the nodes out of the box, but presumably that the path on the node to that local storage would be configurable in a config file.
That's exactly what.
Or sorry, did I mishear that?
Go ahead, Brandon.
That's exactly what that CD operator does. Go ahead, Tim.
No, I think we have same defaults and we can have the seed have configurability, right? So if we pass an initial seed as the startup, sort of profile, if you want to call it that, of what we expect things to do. So that way we get rid of the explicit step and have a more declarative means by which we can stand up everything. Then the user, it's a choose your own adventure, right? The user has, we enumerate this is the ways we configure it, and they can go forth and make goodness.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And the thing that I think is, thank you. I'm being told I can get out of the kitchen where I'm currently having this meeting and into a meeting room because one became available. Sorry. So yeah, I think I think it makes sense to me that the user can. So the thing that's important to me is that KubeADM carries on not having a hard dependency on a cloud provider, so that you can carry on running it on any computers running Linux. And I think at that point it becomes a documentation issue. Like, oh, if you want to mount an EBS, if you are running on AWS and you want to mount an EBS volume on varlib etcd or whatever, then feel free to do that. And then later, as Justin said, more sophisticated swapping disks in and out mechanisms can be developed.
Okay. Are there other questions, or should we move on to the next little bits? Keep moving. All right, so API servers. We currently have a hard dependency on load balancers for load balancing the API server. We don't want to necessarily, we want to be able to have an alternative that may exist there. But we also, a number of issues that we've seen over time is basically people aren't configuring their load balancers properly. So as an action item, we want to make sure that we have good documentation going forwards. And I've leveraged that inside of the main checkpoint list to say update all documentation and supported list of best practices for load balancer configuration. Because there's a number of issues that have occurred in the field or have resulted in changes directly into Kubernetes itself, like the simplest of which is that a lot of people aren't leveraging the health checks on load balancers. So some people have even put a complex logic into the client tooling because they want to make sure that their requests haven't gone into the ether ground, right? Then there's a bunch of other things, setting your timeouts properly, because if you have a very low or default timeout, what you often find is if you're connected to a client, it might disconnect you, or you might have other problems where you have bandwidth problems between your nodes because they're forcing relists because your timeouts keep on triggering. So there's a bunch of minor things there that we've learned over time of how we want to properly configure the load balancers. The second part of being able to...
Can I just pop in there? This section is great. Those two issues, though, are those things we have to fix upstream? Like for A, I think the problem is that the RBAC or the authentication is problematic with a health check. And for B, I think if we were to send a ping or a keep alive, would that solve the problem?
Why is RBAC a problem with the health check?
Because if you turn on, so the health check is, if you have to enable anonymous authentication, which means that then you're one auth-z mistake away from your cluster being accessible to the world. So a lot of real-world customers are unhappy with that, and so they don't do it. So you can't have a health check unless you turn on the anonymous port or something. I don't remember.
Okay, well I see the issue. We have to address it for sure. I think the ability to health check an API server is fundamental, right? And it's part of Kubernetes proper, right? To health check your workloads to see if they're alive, to properly load balance. So I think we need to be able to fix that problem.
Yeah, I think there is an issue, and I guess the question is like, so if we fix that issue, we should definitely, yes, have the health C thing. I'm just saying there is an issue there, and could we have a ping so that we don't need a long keep alive?
It depends on health checks, how keep alives work with that particular load balancer. Some load balancers will keep it alive. Others will have a total limit on the length of any connection, right? I mean, there's different ways to limit that, right? And so, losing a connection is painful here because of resyncs.
Could we make it not painful? Like, could we ever resume?
It actually does its best effort to resume, if possible. We've learned over time, and we fixed as many things as we could, especially with the controller managers, because those are the painful ones, right? Is if they break a watch for whatever reason, they need to be able to make sure that they get the next, as long as the next value that it gets is in order, that means it won't relist, right? But if it got things like a higher resource version than what it expected, you're going to have problems. It'll force the relist to occur. And this is, we could put more logic into the informers to try and do a better sort of incremental update, but it's pretty good the way it is today.
Yeah, we'd really like to fix that at some point. It's like informer API is kind of not ideal. So
that is the most politically correct way to say that. Yes.
Yeah.
I feel like we should also give a prize to the first person that correctly writes an informer watcher and doesn't mess up the controller before the list is completed case. That person should get a gold star. Once I see that they get a gold star.
Well, I copied Andy's rework stuff, so I was able to do it because Andy did a good job in cleaning up the startup routines. So
yeah,
everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if Godspeed. What was the next one? Should we move on to B here? Encouraging source as a default setting. This is because that occur inside the API server. So if you don't, you do a lot of cache misses. So you're gonna have this weird thrashing behavior. Performance expectations will not be exactly what you expected. This is only for the high scale folks. I don't think a lot of other folks will care as much. We did talk about the connection timeouts with expensive relists. And the last bit is just the way that a lot of folks deploy for sensitivity in other regions is they do two separate load balancers, one on the front end and one for the internal. I think that's pretty non-contentious for most people.
That's actually really good advice, and that could help with like the anonymous authentication. I don't know if we don't make any distinction currently in the authentication or authorization layer on that.
I mean, just making the anonymous default to RFC 1918, respecting the proxy headers would be enough to mitigate a lot of concerns.
Except if you're coming through a ELB. Well, yeah, respecting proxy headers, yes, yeah.
Okay, so are there any other questions about the first part of the properly setting load balancer defaults and having documentation to outline these?
I think I understand why I recommend internal external load balancers. If you could just expand it so that so, just like an additional sentence.
Yes. Well, I think it's part of the action item to add more documentation here. All right. Part two was that we don't always want to have the requirements. And in fact, there was like a recently published thing that described like how we can save more money, and one of which is to like get rid of your load balancers.
Quick question on the load balancer stuff, Tim. Sorry to rewind a second here. what's the experience going to be like for users? Are they going to say, I want a load balancer, and then it's just going to be, they're going to have to specify, here's the address to use for that thing. Are they going to have to configure the load balancer themselves? Internally, or what's the thinking there?
I think there are configuration settings that you can use with scripts like Terraform if you want to have some same defaults. Otherwise, having it documented lets it be a choose your own adventure for people who do their own configuration management.
Okay, so just to, there'll be an extra parameter saying I'm load balanced here, and then configure everybody to connect through this load balancer, and then it's left up to the user to figure out how to configure that load balancer.
Yeah,
with
I think we
outside management for other frameworks and stuff like that.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, and with CloudFormation, it kind of gets to be a pain in the butt because you can't know the name of the load balancer that's pointing to you in CloudFormation, right? So you have to create the load balancer, and then you have to have the permissions to add yourself to the load balancer as you come up in your startup script so that you can actually have the name of the load balancer while you're doing your startup script. It's a pain. Yeah.
It's a pain. That's weird. From what I've seen from Terraform, it's pretty straightforward for setting its internal parameters and configs and setting it up.
Okay.
So, but I am no Terraform expert. So the next part was that many people over the course of eons have said we use internal load balancing for IP tables. Why can't we do this for setting the API server? So this option here is that we need to have some type of seed, and I think Brandon and I have gone back and forth on this about how exactly we seed the proxy with a service, such that we can have an initial bootstrapped load balance endpoint, which is specified as part of the manifest that gets brought up, right? And this is by no means the answer. This is like a hack way of doing it. So all options are welcome at this point. But the proposed idea, I think, is to have some type of bootstrap parameter that you specify into the proxy that allows it to set an initial service, right? And this service would not collide with the existing services. That would be one of the requirements. And that way, the kubelet can still talk via IP tables rules to the existing API servers. How that's done yet is still it's more like an RFE to the networking folks that manage kubeproxy.
Well, so another concern here is right now we start the kubeproxy as a daemon set to the kubelet.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
So what we've done, and it's I don't know, it's kind of gross, is we essentially have a snapshotter that snapshots the state of the proxy, essentially IP tables, and persists them to disk, and then restores them before things come back up. And this is to resolve the circular dependency on the etcd. And so that similar resolution could happen for the API server so that we could make it a normal service.
So can you go through again why we don't just modify the client to be able to know that the same cluster is available at multiple IPs?
The answer was that it builds custom logic into the Kubernetes client versus using the same constructs that we already have inside of Kubernetes.
I would argue this is the correct decision. So in etcd, we had smart clients early on, and then everyone screwed it up, period. And so now etcd will transparently forward to the current leader all requests if you hit the wrong one. We give you the option of being smart in order to reduce load. But if you mess up, we aren't going to penalize you and return a 400. We'll just transparently forward it and then return you back 200. That was kind of the compromise we came up with to avoid.
Right. And I think that that's an acceptable way for us to work for Kubernetes also. If we're running active on the API server, then hitting any API server will work. But the client for etcd still actually keeps track of a set of servers it can talk to. It doesn't require, the clients don't require you to actually put a load balancer or some sort of IP tables magic in front of your etcd cluster.
Right. It doesn't require it, but allows you to.
It allows you to do it. We can do the same thing here, right? I feel like it's not. So the official thing that we, the correct way to use Kubernetes is actually, in my mind, is not to use the proxy at all, not to use cluster IPs, but have enlightened workloads that know how to talk to the endpoints API to actually get the list of things that, are the service, right? I mean, it's like, if the clients are smart enough, they should be able to do this type of thing, either via a proxy or via a library that's built into the client. Having, the endpoints API is a piece of crap, but we could actually go through and actually have the cluster itself exposed as an endpoints API type of thing and have everybody know how to actually talk to that and then cache values so that it can, resync itself as it goes.
In the current, sorry.
Yeah, I think there's a general theme is that you can put the logic into two places. Like one is you build it into the client, and two, you build it into some proxying magic. How exactly that proxying magic occurs is I think the debatable piece that we all kind of like, look at and, try to squint to make sense out of it.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention that I think this exact discussion mirrors a discussion we had in Berlin where we were talking about, which I just shared a link to, sort of smart client versus, I think the option that you're calling the proxy option, we called infrastructure agnostic DNS or something. But I think it's the same idea, is that the cluster itself provides some way for dumb clients to find the API servers as they move around.
Something like SRV records, you can have priorities and things like that too, right?
Well, I mean, so if we assume traditional DNS, then that requires you to actually manage and configure a DNS server, which is a whole nother ball of wax.
I think that's what infrastructure, like the idea is, so I think this is great and I like this, and it's at least as elegant as DNS. But I think we could easily have like a local DNS server, just like we have a kube DNS server, right? Like there's no need for it to be a full Route 53 server or a full bind server. Just like we're managing IP tables, we can do some DNS magic.
Okay, so that's an interesting idea. Like, what if we plumb through to the kubelet into the components, the standard client, a way to specify an alternate DNS server instead of actually going through the local resolve. You make that be a parameter, and then you can run like a little mini thing that does whatever magic it needs to do to be able to make that thing work.
So I think at this point, what I think makes a lot of sense is for us to rally around, because I've broken everything up as actionable items, right? So we have a series of actionable items, but the most contentious one, you'll notice, was left for the last because I knew it was going to be most contentious, right?
Well, no, you skipped over the other contentious ones like secrets.
Well, that was basically saying I waved my hands. I fully,
I know, I'm laughing. Okay.
Yeah, I fully absolved myself from secrets, saying that we need to make. I did add that as an action item to this, which would basically say make secrets more secure so we can pass secrets. Because that's a fundamental problem to all of this, right? There's that's an issue here. But I do think enumerating this one as a separate actionable item and having that issue just broken out separately, because I do think it's contentious.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing that I want to try and get to is whether as a group we feel like smart client or smart server is the way to go. Because, I don't know, maybe you need to define what you mean by that, or you can have an opinion on it, but if we, what's the feeling in the room about that distinction? Because
what do you mean by smart server exactly, Luke?
I mean something like an infrastructure agnostic DNS service, or this idea which I'm seeing here, which is to use the kube proxy and set up IP tables records. To me, they're all examples of the same thing, which is make the infrastructure, as in make Kubernetes itself, give you some way of finding the API servers as they move around in an HA cluster.
Okay, so making the infrastructure and giving Kubernetes itself seem like two different things. right? If you're using internal Route 53, that's not a Kubernetes specific thing, but that requires you to manage some external service.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't being clear. The distinction I was trying to draw was simply between the client that talks to the API server versus something behind the API server giving you some way of finding them. I don't know if that helped the distinction, but I was just wondering whether we had, as a group, an opinion on which of those, like if you draw that line, which line do we have a preference for, or which side do we have a preference for?
Just a quick question. If we go with the ladder that you said, like if we go with this kubeproxy kind of setup, how would we deal with like normal kubectl clients against the 3 masters? If we not have the smart client?
So my understanding of the proposal would be that we could just use the existing slightly broken endpoints API in order to find it, because it'll always exist at the same IP or DNS name.
Yep.
I don't think, as far as I understand, and it's a shortcoming of COPS as well, like none of these proposals address like the actual discovery issue. They just move it down a layer, right? So like DNS doesn't solve it, IP tables doesn't solve it, like the core, like extending kubectl doesn't solve it. It just says, well, once we have a seed that is valid, we can find the other ones.
I think so.
I mean, unless I'm missing something, that's what I'm asking, like questions.
Yeah, there's definitely a you know, once you can get your hooks into it, somehow you can expand out from there.
I mean,
I think it's worth having, I don't know how much we want to continue down this discussion here. It might be worth having some dedicated, you know, time to really dig into this. And approach it with like, let's brainstorm all the different things, try and create dichotomies there, and then sort of do a little bit of weighing.
Exactly. So like this here basically weighs 2 options, neither of which I particularly like. Nothing feels elegant, right? It all feels like I'm like putting Bondo on something. So I think enumerating the state space here, but identifying this as like the key thing that a lot of people have desired over time. The question is, it doesn't prevent you or hamstring you from doing this other load balanced approach, right? Which is the current case that exists today.
Well, and DNS, and I'd say that like I think where it gets interesting is what we do in COPS is we query the GCE or AWS APIs. You could imagine it's like the classic discovery problem. You could imagine you do a broadcast if you're on bare metal. I think the point why that's relevant is because we probably don't want to build that into kubectl. So we do want to build it into a separable, replaceable layer. And so then that's why this IP tables thing is nice. That's why DNS is nice. The advantage of DNS over IP tables is you can plug in a full server if you want to. We're not using a custom, like not invented here mechanism. We're using the mechanism for discovery that is used on the internet, right?
My gut here is that an elegant way to actually deal with this is, it doesn't seem crazy to me to actually, change the client, including kubectl, so that it has multiple name resolution strategies where DNS ends up being one of those and the default one. But then we can actually plug in other things. And one of those other things that plugs in might be DNS with an explicitly named DNS server, so you're not, stuck configuring split DNS on machines and stuff like that. Or even something as stupid as, here's something in host file, format, just read that thing directly. Or, hook up to console if you're using console, right? So having a sort of pluggable thing in our clients for, here's a string, resolve this string to something, doesn't seem crazy.
It could be like a shell callout, right? Which could do.
It could be. So I'm just thinking like abstracting the client just one step away lets us really get creative and evolve this over
time. So I think for the purposes of keeping things rolling, I think we can add the item, because most of the other bits, we can break out as separable actionable items where we can start to execute on. Like the config maps is a it can be broken out completely separately. And I don't know if Mike is on the call, but he has proposals that he has been working on to move sort of the components into a component fig that gets loaded via config map. And he has plans that he's going to work on with this release cycle. That's a separable, actionable thing, right? And same with this other item. The contentious ones need to still be hammered out, and I realize that it feels like discussing paint shades with, it's kind of subjective, but I think we can rally to a certain point, and we should do that, but I think we can break it out as a separate issue. I think the other thing.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Tim.
And then lastly, like the documentation pieces and, the one that is very thorny is make secrets more secure.
So one thing that I think would help me a little bit here is to really double down on what is the flow of what people have to type in different scenarios, or at least, what goes into the computers. I think goes into the terminal or, gets run, and then really nailed. I know, so I want to expand on this a little bit. And I'd love to sort of talk about what will it take to get rid of that migrate step, because I think it would be
yes, I think that was part of this. It didn't make it into the doc, but it was part of this discussion up here, right? He had the same comment where wanting to remove the migrate, and then I think that's actually this one. And then I mentioned that if you seed it with the original master configuration, then I think it gets rid of migrate entirely. So this bottom portion with the example flow should be reworked from that comment.
And then the sequence diagram then too.
Yes, the sequence diagram should be updated as well.
Cool. This looks really good. So thank you very much, Tim, for driving this process forwards. Yeah, I wouldn't even say that what you've got listed under contentious is contentious per se. It's more that we just don't know what the best answer is yet. But yeah, but maybe that's a subtle distinction.
Actually, I would go further. I'd be like, I feel like there probably isn't a best answer, which is why it's so hard.
Yeah, makes sense. But yeah, so this is great. Thank you very much indeed. Any other questions or comments on Tim's piece there? Or I will find out what's next on the agenda. Cool. So, Robert, you have a few items on issue triage here. Are you here? I guess maybe he isn't here, so we should go through them. Does anyone?
I think you might be looking at the wrong date, Luke.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you can see I've been out for a couple of weeks. Okay, so Justin's, how can we avoid kubeadm continuing down the path of becoming KubeUp v2?
Yes.
Want to say some words?
Hmm?
I just said, do you want to say some words? But you
I'll
don't.
add some more words. So, I think there were obviously problems with KubeUp, right? But I think one of the sort of systemic problems was that when we were thinking about how we install Kubernetes, we thought about KubeUp. And we didn't put as much effort into the documentation and as much effort into, is this installable, right? Because we're like, oh, we just put it into KubeUp and there's no problem because, yes, it's a horrific script, but it's done. And I love what we're doing in this SIG in terms of, addressing that. But at the same time, we are repeating that mistake to a degree. We are sometimes thinking about kubeadm as the output of the SIG other than fixing Kubernetes installation as the output of this SIG. No one cares whether it's kubeadm or kubeamd or whatever it's called, right? They care about, is Kubernetes easy to install? And I think, so for example, I think this came out of my changing Tim's document or suggesting a change to Tim's document from kubeadm. How do we install kubeadm HA to how to install Kubernetes HA. And I think we want to come up with an HA document that applies to everyone, even if they choose to use Ansible or some other installation tool. And we just have to be really careful that we produce documentation alongside the things we do in kubeadm is, I think, what I would recommend.
I think we've seen a similar situation with the cloud providers where they're essentially under-documented and the only documentation is looking at the various startup scripts that configure them. So I hear what you're saying there, Justin. I think the point that Tim had around documenting best practices around setting up load balancers in front of HA masters, I think definitely moves towards that. I think if we say cluster lifecycle supports doing HA with active using these types of settings, whether you do that via kubeadmin or something else, I think makes a ton of sense. Does that start getting at what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think, yes. And I think I like the idea of kubeadm being an existence proof, right? We should absolutely produce something that works, right? We shouldn't just be like, oh, here's the document and go and like install it, because then we have the same problem where we're like, oh, it's so easy to write in a document and then you try running it and it doesn't work. Right, so it's great that we have something that is an existence proof that is ideally under EDE testing and like continuously test that it works and still works. So that's great. But I think, yes, so documentation as embodied in kubeadm, and yeah, cloud providers are just as.
So I have a question about this point, Justin, which is to what extent would you like kubeadm to be an existence proof versus broken down into such tiny pieces that you can run any of them whenever you like? Does that answer the question, or is it, have I missed the point there?
Actually, like COPS has sort of integrated with kubeadm, and we don't sort of have this problem directly. Like we are able to integrate at the source level and reuse kubeadm. The issue is, I see that what we are recreating with that is a more sophisticated kubeup, right? Like it is a kubeup that like, so let's suppose kubeadm is the salt in this case, and like kubeup is the bash script that drives it. Like in the new world, kubeadm is salt and COPS is the bash script that drives it, right? And is that really any different, or are we just creating the same thing?
So like the way that, so we kind of had this problem at Bootkube. Like we started building a templating engine and it really sucked. And what we ended up doing is essentially removing the templating engine and then relying on other templating engines. So like in our Tectonic installer now, all the like things required to install, Terraform generates and templates stuff. And then really Bootkube just is on the like installation of those manifests into the static manifest directory, and then a little bit of orchestration around bring up and recovery. And it really did come down to like the escaping got crazy at the end of it.
Yeah,
is the worst.
I also think that's why the phases stuff is important as well, to make it like these are the 5 logical things kubeadm is doing, and these are the 5 things that are common for all Kubernetes installations in general. Whatever, regardless of what you like, what solution you use, and then provide some 1 or 2 sample method for bringing up your cluster per phase. Right now we have like one example per phase, and that's the kubeadm toolbox for now. A monolith indeed, but yeah, I think it makes sense, and it's good that you have an eye on us so that we don't fall into the same trap. But
yeah, I think that makes sense. I do think that Justin's point is maybe a little deeper than that, though, which is just to say, whenever we're considering doing something, if we can possibly put it in Kubernetes core, then we should. And I think that's,
yeah, of course.
Yeah. And I think we have already done that fairly well, but we definitely need to keep an eye on that. And especially when it comes to this HA stuff, like how can we put as much of the HA stuff as possible into the core?
So
yeah, And for the bootstrap tokens as well, that's also one part was split out.
So I do want to push back on the KubeUp analogy a little bit. If kubeadmin is the salt in that analogy, kubeadmin can be used for multiple drivers, whereas that salt was really sort of like intertwined with the bash in a super unhealthy way, which meant that every scenario that anybody would want to do would cause them to plumb everything through everything. Whereas, you know, the pattern with the pattern with kubeadmin is that we can provide sort of a easy discoverable path through kubeadmin that'll hit a lot of cases. We can provide some advanced configuration, and not every user, not every framework that's driving it is going to have to configure everything. And that there can, and if we have multiple, whether it be, you know, COPS or Ansible or Terraform or whatever, or CloudFormation that's driving it, that'll actually keep those interfaces cleaner when there's multiple clients. So I totally understand the danger, and I think the danger here is pasting over too much complexity with too much in kubeadmin so that it becomes a really opaque black box, you know, that's redundant, but it becomes a black box to users. And so I think making sure that we document HA the hard way, making sure that we document the phases of kubeadmin and support those, making sure that kubeadmin actually can be used as a sort of education tool for those who are interested to actually understand what's going on under the covers, right? So I think those are all things that we can do to help prevent this stuff from going that way.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one thing I want to work on then during the summer when I get it, and basically make the code for Justin to use better than it is now. It's not ideal, so to say, and both for consumers and the documentation. Soon, when I have time, I'm going to update the phases proposal once again to reflect the current state. And I mean, Justin, you probably have some more comments now that you have integrated.
Yeah, I mean, I've been sending issues. I think it'd be nice to find someone that is going to integrate not at the source code level to guide your phases proposal, because COPS is going to integrate at the source code level. I don't know if anyone's integrating at the phase level.
Yeah, but I think ideally they will be the same, right? I mean, it's a command, whether it's invoked by the CLI or by the command package, right? So
yeah, but we can call into your, like, we call in deep into your functions, like we call into like,
yeah, I know, and that's what
I heard someone say recently that vendoring is not a componentization tool or a componentization mechanism. But anyway, this is a longer conversation.
Sorry, one more thing. Justin's original point, our mission statement for the SIG has been labeled work in progress for a really long time, and it looks like no one's made any edits for like 7 or 8 months. And I don't really see it come up. Like I would love to see it become a crisp enough document that it's the meter stick, it's the rubric that we use whenever someone talks about adding a new feature or submits a PR. We say, is this really in line with what we think our mission statement is? But I think it's gone underutilized so far.
Yeah, that's a good point. Mea culpa. If Justin, for example, if you wanted to propose an amendment to the mission statement that I could review, then that might be a better way than me just promising to put it on my to-do list.
But where is the mission statement?
I think it's on the wiki. Oh no, it's in the community, github.com/kubernetes/community. Maybe. Anyway, I suggest we use the last 4 minutes to address the last agenda item. And that is, if I'm looking at the right date, Jacob's 1.6.0 post-mortem action items.
Yeah, so this is half broadcast of status and half solicitation for new owners. So a few of these are in progress or done. We had end-to-end tests for our master branch, but not for the release branch. That got done right away. Our new poll job has been in review for a while. I think that's close to LGTM. And someone from EngProd has signed up for I think they're going to do it at the test grid level, so you can actually configure that when your tests start failing, that you can actually proactively notify the SIG, which would be great because our job kept going red and no one noticed for a really long time. It's red right now because someone else broke it and we're trying to fix it right now. But the things that are unknown, and maybe I can use the tactic of long, awkward silences to peer pressure people to volunteer for these, but I'll just go through them really quickly. So adding new end-to-end variants that use other CNI providers, possibly first-class citizens like Bridge. Right now we just use WeaveNet, so it's one signal, but we could have many more signals. If WeaveNet breaks, it won't be easy enough to tell who's at fault. So the more providers that we have, the better signals we have. Let's see, having a process for triaging and fixing kubeadmin end-to-end tests right now has been kind of a solo job. I'm definitely willing to help out the how. Like I've had these notes piling up of how our end-to-end tests work and how to debug them for a long time, and it's just taken me a long time to create a consumable document out of that. But I don't know if I have enough bandwidth this quarter to really define a triage process. There have been many different scenarios under which they break. There's legitimate kubeadmin regressions. There's regressions in our dependencies in the test infrastructure that we build upon. There's breakage of the CNI provider. There are all these different ways. So once we figure out, maybe having a rotation or some way that once we're notified that something breaks, someone could do a quick investigation to find out what broke, and then having some sort of policy around who should actually fix that. Ideally, the person who broke things, we have some agreement with their team, like the Engprod team that owns the test infrastructure, that they'll actually fix things that they break for us. And then we didn't really have a kubeadmin defined release process, obviously because we were alpha for so long. And Kubernetes has kind of a shaky release process overall. I looked into Kops's release process, and I really like that. It's much more clear about the expectations from one release to another, the steps to perform a release. Kubeadmin, we didn't have an explicit, like, make sure you set up these end-to-end tests, make sure that we release new Debian and RPM packages, all the steps that are kind of tribal knowledge that if someone goes on vacation, we're obviously going to miss something. Now that we're beta, it'd be great to enumerate those and make sure we have an explicit checklist for every release. And the last one is more Kubernetes wide, but one of the things that we got criticized for during this interesting event at the 1.6.0 release was poor communication. So we had multiple GitHub issues opened, essentially tracking the same failure of 1.6.0 kubeadmin. It wasn't clear which one was authoritative. There was really high noise to signal for any particular community watching them. So if you were a user interested in when things are going to get fixed and when you can expect a new release, it didn't really address that for you. If you were trying to coordinate who's fixing what in what ways, it didn't really address that. Like, they were just catch-all issues. So if we had an official protocol, especially since these times can be stressful and everyone's just trying to get things done as quickly as possible, and they don't think about the right way of doing things, to say, if we have a critically impaired release, we know there's functionality critically broken, here are the steps to go through. You proactively engage the community in this way. You create an authoritative GitHub issue and track things in a certain way until completion. But since we had none of that, it was very ad hoc and it didn't work well for anyone. So I think this would be a great task for the PM team or someone on the PM team. But if anyone in the SIG is interested in attempting to craft such a document, even just a bare bones starter document, that'd be great. But does anyone want to raise their hand for any of those? Otherwise, I'll continue to pester you next week.
So on the communication side of the things, is this something that you think should be specific for kubeadmin, or something that maybe should be taken up in SIG release to really, cover all sorts of issues coming out of a release?
Yeah, I see it as a Kubernetes wide. I don't think that we've had in recent memory a 0.0 release that was flawless. Like we always immediately follow up with a 0.1. And
Have we ever had anything that was flawless?
That's just software. That's pretty normal for software. But anyway, we are out of time. So can we just wrap up in the next 30 seconds? I would love it if someone raised their hand to help out with Jacob's list.
Well, George raised his hand, it looks like.
Oh, nice.
Chatty did.
Or was that just him like waving to say goodbye to the people who are leaving on the hour?
I don't know. Oh,
That
maybe
was
that
me
was it.
waving to say goodbye.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I didn't know I got volunteered for something.
George,
I want to help, but personally, I'm overcommitted, so I can't sign up for anything more right now.
Yeah, me too. Sorry.
Yeah, same here. Sorry.
So keep bugging us.
sure,
Please do.
will do. All right, thanks, guys.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. Okay, great. See you all next Tuesday. Thanks, everyone. Bye.